Hey folks, Alex Wiseman here. I wanted to have a chance to talk to you a little bit about chapter 16 from our Manna and McGinn book on educational governance for the 21st century. This chapter 16, written by Kenneth Meyer, called From Theory to Results in Governance Reform, is, I think, a really good summary chapter for a lot of the information that was in this book overall. I know there's another chapter after this by Manna and McGinn. But what Meyer does in chapter 16 is really look at how you can do this sort of theory to practice path with governance. And he does summarize a lot of the different approaches to governance reform that we might see in not just the text and the other chapters from this book, but also in educational reform more broadly speaking. And since one of the challenges for us is to think about how do we go from education policy broadly speaking at this governance level to actually implementing those policies and then following up on those policies and sustaining those policies and their implementation moving forward. This is a really important chapter for us. It does have a lot to do with the reform of governance itself, though. And so what I wanted to do was take a look at some of the specific things, and you can see that I've taken photographs of the pages in my book, so you can see the parts that I underlined when I wrote this and that I think we should talk about. But I wanted to focus a little bit on what Meyer specifically said about each of the different ways of reforming governance in the United States. There are several different ways that we're going to go through. Obviously, there's the governance reform as a structural problem, and then as an oversight problem, as a political problem, as a network management problem, and as an incentives problem. And then I want to quickly address some of the alternative proposals for reforming education governance that Meyer introduces right at the end of this chapter, and just make some brief comments about them. So let's look at each of these different types of approaches to governance reform, and let's talk about what that kind of means and what Meyer is saying and how we might interpret it. If you haven't Googled Kenneth J. Meyer, you should do that, get a feel for his background, his perspective, his way of thinking about education policy and education governance overall. That'll really help you as you move forward. And one of the things that I know we've talked about in the past, but I want to reemphasize, is that you should be continually aware of your own perspective. What do you bring to the party, so to speak, and what is your political leaning or bent? Being self-aware about that is really important, not because you want to identify what's right and what's wrong. That's not the way that we're talking about it. It's because you want to identify where your expectations and where your expertise and where your experiences lie, because that will help you identify not only what your sort of framework or paradigm is for looking at education policy, but it also helps you understand where your biases are and where you might take a particular perspective that would conflict with someone else's perspective, and what are your reasons for doing that. So it's a really important thing to be self-aware about this. Okay. So let's talk about governance reform as a structural problem, and I've got this huge quote from page 357 here. Let me see if I can get my cursor to light up. Ta-da, there we go. So the question is, how can structure create incentives and biases for quality education, putting aside for now what we might mean by quality? The idea is that, and this is the part that I have underlined down here, in the United States, the dominant governance structure at the local level, which is really the level where we could see some real variation potentially, but the dominant governance structure is the independent school district. And remember, the independent school district is exactly that, it is largely independent. There are things that might bound the, or restrict or limit the choices and the activities and the policies and everything else that independent school districts can make, either because of state level restrictions or federal level of restrictions. But usually in the United States, there's a lot of latitude in terms of what independent school districts can do. The state and the federal government have more influence in terms of providing funding, and so sort of the purse string way of governing, rather than actually setting policies and prescriptions. So they can provide money, they can deny money, but other than that, it's kind of a weak system in our federal system, broadly speaking, where we have this series of nested relationships between the local, the state, and the federal government. So that's really important, that there's really wide variation in the quality of education. This is the other point that Meyer's making. Even though we have a relatively stable, I think Meyer might argue stagnant, governance structure at the local level. And one of the reasons why this is important is because this means that the governance structure itself is not necessarily contributing to or detracting from the quality of education that's provided. It means that the governance structure is a norm or a function of habit or something that has been established and institutionalized, and therefore is replicated, and there's a lot of legitimacy and trust in the system, even though there are really not many results that are directly attributable to the independent school district mode of governing. Okay, so that's important, because what he's saying is that maybe we should think about alternative ways of governing our local education systems that might have different impacts. And you'll see that there are, in fact, in this class, we've talked a little bit and we've watched some videos about and read some stuff about state level takeover of local level school districts and other sorts of shifts in the way that local level governance in education works. That's really important to consider and to think about, because the way that education is then implemented, the things that we do at the local level, are more likely to be impacted by the governance structure at the local level when it is different from the independent school district. Okay, so Meyer highlights on pages 357 and 358, right at the top, that any change in governance structure can generate change in goals and processes and create potentially different incentives for the actors. So what kind of change in the local governance system should we be thinking about, especially if we're interested in how to translate policy that is often very broadly stated and sort of meets a goal or overall agenda, but doesn't necessarily articulate how that policy is meant to be specifically implemented in every context. How do we change the governance structure so that we can facilitate that implementation that is more closely aligned with local context? So one of the things that I would suggest would be to think back to the scissor model and to think about how we might be incorporating the sustainability idea here. So, I mean, independent school districts have the opportunity for local level stakeholders to be champions, to be part of the empowerment process, to be really embedded in the political system that governs education at the local level so that they can help make those long-term decisions. But we have to think of what might be an alternative to that. And that's one of the challenges, and I'm by the way, not going to suggest a solution here. I'm just encouraging you to continue to think about it. But one of the things that we really have to think about, I think, as we're moving forward is, what are the alternatives to education as we know it? It doesn't necessarily have to be the way that Manna and McGinn, the authors of the chapters in their book, talk about, although it could be. But if there's something different than the traditional way of governing education and implementing education, then we probably want to think about what it might be and ways that we could implement it in a way that wouldn't be disruptive to students' learning overall, but also might be more efficient and effective in terms of implementing that at the local level, whatever that might be. Okay, I'm trying to switch slides. Governance as I have so many little things that pop up on the screen. As an oversight problem. Yes, that's next. Good. So I have three quotes or three sections from this small section that I wanted to highlight that span sort of across pages 358 and 359. The first one being from the very first paragraph in this section, where Meyer says that the clear weakness of the current education governance system is its inability to address the failure of schools. And one of the things that it points out is that schools are often run by civil servants who lack the autonomy or the political support to take independent action. And so the governance system ignores failures. That's a really strong statement, and one that I think we should take note of, because the ways that failures might be ignored is a key for us in terms of thinking about, again, how do we translate policy to practice, and how do we create sustainable policy that can be implemented over the long term. So rather than, I guess, focus on the ignoring part right now, I want to focus on the failure part. So when we talk about governance system itself ignoring failures and question what the failures are, the failures are, I mean, I think Meyer is broadly talking about the fact that education doesn't exactly correlate or translate into opportunities or income or all the kinds of benefits that sort of the idea of education suggests. Instead, what we see is that education is still predominantly a function of socioeconomic status and family background. Remember the Coleman report from our discussion about funding. So we have to be interested in not only why things fail, but how the governance system of education at the local, state, and federal level approaches those failures, or responds to those failures, or predicts and eliminates the failures before they occur, if that indeed were to happen. Failures can also often be due to a misalignment between activity at the local level and the goals of the broader policy. So this could also be an alignment issue. This oversight problem is an alignment issue between the policy intention and the policy implementation. By the way, I'll make an analogy here. If any of you as educators or at any point in your educational career have looked very closely at curriculum studies, perhaps you are an educator and you had some class on curriculum and instruction at some point, you'll note that there are many different kinds of curriculum. There's a hidden curriculum, which people love to talk about, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, at some point in more detail than we have in this class. But a more important thing, I think, to think about is what is the intended curriculum, what is the implemented curriculum, what is the received curriculum. Now, there are other ways to use those terms, but the idea that there's an intention about what it might be, there's a different version, maybe modified from the intended version, that is implemented, and then there's yet another version that's probably modified from the implemented version, that is the received version. And then you could take it further and talk about the performed version, like what then do people who receive the curriculum, those are students, then do with that information. But if we just talk about intention, implementation, and reception or understanding, that gets us pretty far. And we can do the same with policy. What was the intention of the policy? And again, this is a very functional perspective, meaning that the policy we're assuming has been made and then required, as they're instituted, because it is meant to make some sort of positive impact or change. Not, we're assuming that it's not just a political agenda. So if it's intended to do something, what is that intention? As it's implemented, does it align with that intention? And then as it's received, does it still align with that intention? Even though the process goes from intention to implementation to reception, the alignment always goes back to the intention. So we could have an alignment issue here when we talk about the governance system leading to failures. Well, the failure could be that there isn't the implementation of the policy as it was intended. So the same might be true if, say, for example, you were creating a policy response for a state education agency that was interested in how they might make adjustments in response to the school closures around COVID-19 and the impact that that has had on student learning outcomes. I'm just saying that might be something that you could think about. Well, as new policies are made to address, or as policy responses are proposed to address those student learning outcome, quite frankly, losses as a result of these school closures around COVID-19, or the shift in delivery model from face-to-face to online as a result of COVID-19, or all the other plethora of things that are affecting student learning outcomes around COVID-19. We can think about then, how are those new policies aligning with the implementation? What is the intent of those policies? Is there a specific intent, or is it just sort of a broad band-aid that's being laid across the problem? And then is it implemented in a way that fulfills that intent? If it isn't, then it might be considered a failure. Okay. What are some ways that failures are ignored? That's a pretty important question. Well, one might be, and there's an example that is given by Meyer in this chapter a little further down on this page. It's not one of the quotes that I have listed here, that talks about when a charter school fails, then kids get dumped back into the regular public school system. In other words, there's no consequence. There's no way to address or accommodate some sort of change to prevent this failure or to ameliorate the effects of the failure, other than dumping the kids back into the public school system once that charter school fails. Now, that's a problem unique to charter schools. You wouldn't necessarily see people dumped from one school to another in other situations all the time, although it can happen. But it's a good one to think about. Another quote, also from further down on page 358, that bleeds over onto 359 with these last two words. Meyer says, one can question the will of either politicians or bureaucrats to make the tough decisions that are needed if one is to rely on governance reforms that encourage experimentation and innovation. This is especially the case since even terrible schools seem to generate some vigorous support from parents and community leaders. Okay, so this idea about the will of politicians or bureaucrats to make tough decisions in order to have all these wonderful things happen. I get it, and that's, for me, that's a way to sort of, how do I put it? That's a flag to me that Meyer is sort of waving his particular political perspective here. But this last sentence of this statement, this is especially the case since even terrible schools seem to generate some vigorous support from parents and community leaders. If you'll remember the EdNext, or the Education Next poll, and the Phi Delta Kappa poll about expectations around education and the different responses that people have based on their political affiliation, based on their insider or outsider role in education, like are they teachers, are they parents, or based on the fact that we're thinking about schools that are in their community or that their kids go to versus the schools in the state or in the nation. This is a really important part of understanding why there's often vigorous support from parents and community leaders, especially from the schools that their own children attend and from schools in their own communities, because we know from the data from these polls that year after year, literally decade after decade, parents and community leaders will more strongly support their local schools, even if those schools are technically failing schools. If they're not doing well, if they're underperforming, if governance at the school level is a mess, if teachers are even harming students sometimes, parents and community leaders, they're not supporting people harming kids, but they might support the school overall and say this is a challenge and a problem, but we support our school and we support our community, and so we have to get through this. And remember, one of the reasons for this is because in the United States, we have a very much a local control ideology. And schools being locally controlled and schools as a representative of local control and the community around that school is a very strong ideology that permeates education and permeates our political process around education even now. Okay, last quote from this section comes from page 359. Meyer says, an important question is whether in an era of long-term economic scarcity, political decision makers are willing to allocate funds to oversight and regulation rather than to simply funding services. So the idea, again, is that there is some sort of understanding that if you are monitoring and evaluating, they're using the terms oversight and regulation. If you are holding an education system accountable at the local level as well as the state and federal level, then there is some way to address the problems that exist, or to push or coerce or otherwise nudge change in a certain direction because you have oversight and regulation authority. This is related in many ways to our look briefly in week 3 about at the two-level game, and I'm going to talk about that a little later right now, but at the two-level game document from our German colleagues at the University of Bremen. You'll remember that we talked about standards and standard setting being one of the ways that organizations outside of the government can I almost use the word manipulate, but I guess that's a good word. They can manipulate, or they can influence, or they can somehow adjust how those education systems are governed if they have standards and oversight responsibilities. That's a really important thing to think about. And one of the things, or one of the critiques that Myers sort of sneaks in here, is that they're saying that people need to be willing to allocate funds to oversight and regulation rather than simply funding services. The idea is that, or Myers making the point that how do I say it again? He's arguing that education, schools, districts, systems at the state level are simply providing services without any recognition of whether the service is working, whether it's having the intended impact, whether it's actually efficient or effective. Those are words that Meyer loves to use, and I'm going to pick on him for using those words later, because it suggests that there's this abandonment of, of actually making sure that what is supposed to be accomplished is being accomplished, and instead just doling out resources without any sort of accountability tied to that. Okay. Next, governance reform as a political problem, which is on page 359. Meyer says that, let's see, one theme of proposed governance changes is to vest additional powers in more general elected officials like governors, mayors, and so on, rather than in independent school boards, which often are dominated, particularly in small districts, by the superintendent. The idea is that generalist politicians are not captured by the biases in existing governance systems and will bring in values that emphasize quality education. So this is a perspective from Meyer that I'd like to push back on a little bit, because I don't agree. I'm going to take the local control angle here and say that I don't agree that these additional powers, as Finn and Petrilli are suggesting, should be vested in more general, in other words, at a higher administrative level, so governors, mayors, etc. We know that those are already the executive level of educational decision making. From the first week when we looked at governance structures, and the governor in all of the states is the chief education officer, although technically that's not true. There is a chief education officer who's separate from the governor. But since states in the United States are the ones that have the responsibility for education and not the federal government, that means that the governors are the first line of defense, the first line of decision making, the first, it should be the ones, as Truman said, where the buck stops, although they aren't always. But governors and mayors are definitely the ones that are in charge of or elected to govern the communities in where schools are located. And schools are community organizations. I'm not talking about community schools specifically. That's a whole different topic. I'm just saying that schools reflect the values, the understanding, the knowledge, the skills, and are embodied with people who are from those communities, whether that community be the state or be the local districts. So the idea, though, that generalist politicians like governors, mayors, etc., are not captured by the biases in existing governance systems is, I think, untrue. I can think of a lot of examples where governors, mayors, etc., are completely biased, and they have very strong political perspectives that can even often work against their community's own best interest. I'm thinking right now of a governor in the United States who is suing a mayor of a city in that state for making a mask requirement in response to the coronavirus epidemic, when the governor has said that that is not going to be a requirement. That's an interesting conflict between local control and then more centralized control. And it harkens to me back to the idea about the centralization of power and authority and the decentralization of responsibility for implementation, responsibility and accountability. What we want to avoid is that dichotomy between the power and authority and the responsibility and the accountability. We want to make sure that those are more overlapping or more integrated, if anything. Or if in the United States, where we value local control, we want to push the power and authority down and have all of that rest at a more grounded level of governance. Now, what does this have to do with our persistent problem of policy to practice. Well, one of the issues that it has to do with is if you're thinking about how do you translate a policy at a more centralized level to practice at a local level, if you're dichotomizing again, you're vesting power and control at that upper level, and you're pushing responsibility and implementation to the lower levels, then you're going to have misalignment. You're going to have a lot of miscommunication that's going to occur, and there's going to be a lot of mistranslation of the intended policy to the implemented and received policy, whatever that might look like. Okay, let's talk about governance reform as a network management problem. I forgot the "as" in a lot of these. Anyway, that's all I'm noticing is that I screwed up on my slides. Anyway, governance reform is a network management problem. So if we look at page 361, right at the beginning of this section, Myers says the reality of U.S. public schools is they are not walled off from other units of government. They operate in a complex network of other governmental units, nonprofits, and for-profit organizations that deal with healthcare, vocational training, safety, and other issues. And managing this network takes substantial time and resources. And he goes on to quote the Texas Superintendent Management Survey, where basically superintendents said, leave us alone. We just want to do more school stuff. It's more eloquently articulated in the text, but that was basically what they said. So this is a really important point, and I think that this is, I'm going to argue that Myers is a little off here in that I don't think superintendents are saying we don't want to deal with healthcare and vocational training and safety and other issues, because, I mean, unless you're just training everybody to be a professor, which, by the way, it's a great job, I highly encourage it, you have to be providing these other services to support the needs of the community as well as the career and academic aspirations and needs of both the community and the individuals in the school. So these other issues that might be advocated for by other governmental units, nonprofit organizations, for-profit organizations that deal with healthcare, okay, blah, blah, blah. If we're incorporating all of these different entities into the decision-making or the governance sort of context, then really what we're talking about now is we're back to Lutz and company's two-level game again. And we're thinking about how organizations that are apart from the government-sponsored education system can either influence decision-making in the education system or can actually shape policies that would then be implemented in schools. That is something that happens all the time. It also adds capacity, I would argue, when you have these other organizations that are doing this. Now, one of the things that he points out later on, just a paragraph later, is this idea of goal ambiguity, the argument that if we have multiple organizations that are trying to sort of all vie for attention and have their own agendas and their own lobbying, capabilities, that it becomes ambiguous what the point of education is. That I don't think is a very valid argument, because it's fairly clear that the goal of education, broadly speaking, anyway is ambiguous. So I'm just going to argue that it's going to be ambiguous whether these organizations are involved in influencing decision-making and policies or not. But also that we have to think about the fact that there are several goals that are really meaningful and worthwhile. We do want to make sure that the kids that are in our schools are healthy and are fed. And I'll just start with nutrition and health, a really important component, because schools have become, in most of the country, the de facto institution that provides, literally in some cases, 24-hour care for the students that are part of that school or part of that district. That is a key function in a country that doesn't have universal health care, because we don't have an opportunity for kids to receive all of the different things that they might need as part of a broader sort of social system. And I'm not talking socialist system, I'm just talking about a healthcare system that provides basic needs for its citizens. Then the schools take on that responsibility, and whether they do that as part of their government-sponsored function, or whether they do that in collaboration with or in partnership with for-profit organizations or other sorts of nonprofit organizations, will vary from district to district and school to school. But the fact that it happens, I don't think is leaving goal ambiguity. It's a goal regardless. The argument that I think Meyer and a lot of people who are writing in this text that we're looking at have or envision for education is much more of a narrowly focused academic goal. So the idea is to learn. The idea is to amass knowledge that then can be converted into some sort of skill. And it's a very linear argument. It's a very 1 + 2 = 3 argument, or A + B = C argument. If you have a strong curriculum and you have a well-managed organization, then you will produce individuals who have high levels of understanding, and that they can convert that high level of understanding and the skill that follows that into income or status or whatever it is they need in the larger community. That's the argument, that's the assumption, that's that linear sort of human capital arrangement that many policymakers probably don't recognize they're doing, but they're doing. And I think a lot of families and individuals do that as well, because it's a very easy argument to understand. However, the world is not linear. Things don't run in a straight line. There's lots of intervention, there's lots of complexity, there's lots of ambiguity, and there's lots of irrationality that takes place from all perspectives and all sides. And so anyway, I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but this goal ambiguity is not necessarily, I don't think, the problem. I would think instead we want to think about how we manage or harness the ways that these other organizations outside of government-sponsored school organizations influence not just governance of education, but also the policy intention, implementation, and reception that goes on. And so remember, when we looked at the Lutz two-level game document, we looked at these different governance instruments. And I told you before that this is an international focused argument, although these same instruments are at work in the local context. So discursive dissemination simply means establishing ideas, setting the agenda. Standard setting we talked about already, but it's a way of prescribing behavior based on outcomes or outputs that are coming out of the education system. Financial means is simply infrastructure resources actually coercing through fiscal opportunity. And then coordinated activities and technical assistance. I think you know, we talked about this before, that I kind of lump these two together, although they're not exactly the same. But if you provide a service that actually has some sort of a decision-making function where you can be in charge of monitoring and evaluation or oversight and regulation, as Meyer said earlier, then you're doing this surveillance coordinated activity function. If you're providing some sort of service that it allows for the either strategic development of a plan for the school or the system, or it is collecting and interpreting the data that tells you how that system is doing, it's very closely aligned with these coordinated activities, then you're also able to set the agenda and prescribe behavior and oftentimes get money. So these two can draw off of these first three. I did put this whole title up here so that you can Google it if you'd like to. It's downloadable off the internet for free. You might want to take a look at it, because I think that the way that Lutz and colleagues talk about this two-level game is a really important one. And if we want to take it just one step further, you'll see that they also in this same document have this theoretical model for how to explain change in educational policymaking. And again, all we have to do is think about how do we shift this down a level. So instead of international organizations, these can be any sort of non-school organization. That can be another government agency, that can be a nonprofit organization, that can be a research institute, that could be a higher education institution, all sorts of different organizations that might be involved in some of these governance instruments that are listed here. These are the same things from that table we just looked at. And then you have the idea that using these different tools, these organizations can influence, in this case, we might say local level or state level education policymaking, but it can also be national, but they can influence how policymaking goes into either converge or diverge, depending on how they're manipulating these governance instruments from existing policy. There are also some other ideas, and I won't go into this too much here, but you can take a look at the document itself if you want to learn more. They talk about these transformation capacities. In other words, it's the capacity of the unit that is making the education policy. So in this case, it's the nation, so it's national transformation capacities. We might think of it as the state or the local community. But these have very much to do with the stakeholder perspectives. So what are the ideas and expectations that stakeholders in that community have? And there are some ways that Lutz and company define them that it's interesting, but I don't think you need that for what we're talking about. More importantly, I think, is this idea of veto players, and we're back to our understanding of sustainability and how do we get champions to be involved in this. So if there are veto players, people who have high interest and high power, but they're resisting whatever the change is or whatever policies that this governance system is trying to make, then they can also have a competing influence on either the convergence or divergence of new policies from what formerly exists. In other words, they can make it look more like what we already have, or they can reform it so that it is farther away. So, okay, so I'll just leave it there. Okay, kind of talked about goal ambiguity already. Let's talk about governance reform as an incentives problem. This starts on page 361 and goes on to page 362. So again, this is very much related to our sustainability issue, and I'm going to just make it clear that there are different ways to create sustainability. One of the ways, and in fact, there are three ways, which I think I might have mentioned to you in a previous discussion, three ways that change occurs, and three ways that stakeholders are either brought into or pushed out of both the governance structure and a policy to practice process. Those are, we're going to use the word isomorphism. So isomorphism is a term that means basically slow change towards some sort of shared or similar expectation or experience or structure. There are a couple of different ways to do this. One is coercion. So you can coerce. That is this financial means. We talked about that. That's a way of coercing. Standard setting can be a way of coercing. So there are some ways we've talked about you can coerce already. Another way is mimetic isomorphism. So the idea that you can mimic or copy what others are doing. Again, if we go back to our governance instruments, discursive dissemination, standard setting, and these sorts of activities, less so financial means, but it certainly could be there. But all these are ways that you could copy. You could say, all right, we have seen, I'm in the state of Texas. Texas has seen that California has a really good way of approaching immigration reform related to school age youth. We want to mimic that. And so we're going to look at their proclamation, their broad statement, and we're going to mimic that. And we're going to use that to establish our own agenda at our state level for what immigration policy should look like related to school age youth. That's a really important way that you can start to change the incentives for politicians, educators, and parents. And then a final isomorphism is normative isomorphism. So this is probably the hardest to explain and the most important of all of them, because this has to do with how do we develop a system where the culture shifts, where the expectations of the broader community shift, and where our stakeholders, especially at the delivery end of our policy reform, are part of the process, and are empowered by the process, and are really the champions for implementing the policy in a way that is aligned with the intended policy. So it helps us when we think about how do we make our own proposals for a response to, let's say, COVID-19 school closures and the effects that that's had on student learning outcomes, because we can start to think that there are multiple ways that we might eventually get to some sort of a sustainable system where politicians, educators, and parents are all incentivized to be a part of this process. They're all embedded champions of the process. So What the argument that Meyer makes is to succeed in reforming education governance systems, we need reformers who are willing to invest their careers in substantial resources in advocacy and in implementation, and that it's a long-term and continuous process. That is the point of isomorphism. That is isomorphism. It's a long-term and continuous process. Now you know that we could talk about coercive, mimetic, and normative isomorphism. And hopefully, after our brief discussion just now, you have some idea of what that looks like when we're talking about the sustainability part of our scissor model. Last but not least, Meyer comes up with several alternative proposals to change education governance. And so I want to mention each of those briefly. One is that he talks about school size. This is the take size seriously argument. This is on page 363, and that there are basically disadvantages to having larger schools and larger districts. And the argument is that there should be smaller ones because they can be more contextualized and efficient. I think that's a really good point, and I don't disagree with that. Smaller size institutions is a good one. The problem is our funding system. Our funding system in the United States does not allow for that sort of specialization. In fact, we have the opposite problem. As funding drops for education, we have to consolidate more because it saves costs. It allows us to reduce the number of teachers that are needed. It allows us to offload infrastructure like buildings or football fields or whatever else that cannot be fiscally maintained. It allows a lot of it allows us to take care of a lot of those problems. I forgot where I was going with that. So take size seriously is a great recommendation. I just don't see how that is possible until we have as he puts it, a more effective and efficient school finance system. Now, this is where I pick on Meyer and everyone else who uses these terms for using the words effective, efficient, success. These are all words that, I'll just be honest, don't mean anything unless you explain to the audience or the listener or the reader what you mean. So what is an effective school finance system? Does that mean that the people who put in the most get the most out? Because that's what wealthy communities would like it to mean. Does it mean that it provides the most evenly distributed resources and opportunities across a otherwise unequal community? Because that's what more left-leaning educators and community members would like. Same with efficient. I don't really know what that means. Does that mean you can get higher test scores with a lower level of money put into the system, which means that Utah is probably the best system we can think of because they put so little money into their education system compared to other states, and yet they have some of the highest student achievement outcomes that exist. We looked at that in the funding discussion earlier. So I hate the use of this word effective, efficient, success. I am embarrassed that I used it earlier, and I will pick on you if you use it in your own writing or your proposals or anything else. So try to avoid that without defining it. But the argument that Meyer makes about moving to a more effective and efficient school finance system is not necessarily, I mean, it's one paragraph. It's not really an argument for how to fix it. He just makes the point that basing funding for schools on local property tax, predominantly in the United States, is arcane. It is not a modernized system of funding education. And I will say, since he talks about it making little sense in the globalized economic system, that's a quote from page 363, I will echo that. There is no other country in the world that funds education in the way that we do in the United States. And there's a reason for that. It's not a very good way of funding education. All right, next, use markets effectively. Again, this author and this book leans to the right. The market argument is a very strong and a persuasive argument out of right-leaning educational reformers, politicians, community members, everyone else. The idea behind charter schools and behind voucher systems and school choice is a market argument that if you allow schools, and they would definitely use the term allow, if you allow schools and communities to compete around education, then the best systems will survive and the worst systems will disappear. Excuse me. The problem with that model is that the worst systems often are in the lowest income and the most disadvantaged communities, which means that their schools go away and now they have to figure out, well, how do we get to the private school across town or the public school in the wealthy community? That is not an automatic transfer. That doesn't just magically happen when bad schools go away. And so the problem with our system is that it's not, our education system, is that it doesn't function very well in a market environment. I'll use another example. There are many companies over the years that have tried to privatize education, specifically the academic function of education. There are a lot of, by the way, private supplementary services. Food service, privatized and outsourced. Security, often privatized and outsourced. Other sorts of supplementary things, athletics can also be privatized and outsourced. But what we're talking about is the academic function. How can we use markets effectively to improve or to reform the academic function of education? So there have been a lot of privatized organizations that I've talked about before who've done a very good job of streamlining. They've cut down costs. They've managed to provide a high quality curriculum. I wouldn't argue that at all, with in many cases very high quality teachers. However, it's rarely sustainable. The problem is that education, the way that it is seen in the United States and around the world, is as a public good. A public good is often not something that you can have equitable arrangement around in a market system, because a market system is by definition not an equitable system. That's why it's a market system, right? There are winners and losers. And unfortunately, in education, when you have already winners and losers in the broader community, if you make the education system also a system of winners and losers, then you have people who are and aren't going to benefit from it. Healthcare is a similar institution where we have winners and losers. I happen to be in the winner category. I work at an institution that provides healthcare for me through my job. I'm able to afford it even if I wasn't able to do that because of the income that I make. Lots of reasons why I have access to that. Not everyone has access to that system because we have a market-driven healthcare system in the United States. So there's a majority of people, especially in low-income areas, who do not have any healthcare at all. They don't have any sort of healthcare program. And so when they need to go to the doctor or go to the hospital, they're left to their own devices and they have to either pay up front. What they usually end up doing is using the emergency room, et cetera, and costs skyrocket after that. We don't have those kinds of alternatives for education. Instead, what happens is that when we have a market-based system for education, usually the people who lose in that system, there are no education emergency rooms. That doesn't exist. So what it means is that they get a low quality or no quality education, which then does not serve them at all in any way for work, for status in the community, for general knowledge and skill. And so I will argue that one very hard. That's probably the one where I most diverge from the more right-leaning argument. So you got a little bit of Alex on the podium there, sorry. Next, create an efficient accountability system. We already talked about this. This is one of those governance instruments, right? Standard setting and coordinated activities. These are two key ways to influence the governance of education in the United States and in states specifically. An efficient accountability system, again, I have no idea what Meyer means by efficient, other than it has to close down failing schools, it has to support charter schools and privatization. I would argue with the way that he's trying to do this because it looks like the market system. But the fact that accountability can be a very productive way to see what's working, what isn't working, and keep that alignment between the policy and the practice going is 100% true. Abolish the education degree, another one that I would disagree with. This is the idea that we should take away specific degrees at universities and colleges around education, and people should instead study what they're going to be teaching. That's a great idea, and I actually worked at an institution, two institutions before this one, where that was our approach for people who are going to be teaching middle and high school. If you wanted to be an English teacher, you majored in English, and then we would provide the supplementary coursework that would help you get certified through the state of Oklahoma in science. In fact, our whole elementary school system in the United States, as in much of the world, is a more holistic approach to education. And so it would be very difficult to have an elementary school teacher who was a science major. Not because, they'd be great at science, but they might not necessarily know how to teach those other subjects, because at the elementary school level, we don't have specialists in different subjects that teach the students. We have a generalist in those subjects that teaches the students. And we have some very good generalists. Now, there are alternative ways to go about providing that expertise. Some elementary schools do provide rotation between different teachers that have expertise in a certain area. And if that was the model across the United States, then perhaps we could abolish the education degree as it currently sits, but it would be difficult. The other point that that Meyer makes in the abolish the education degree section is a good one, and I think it takes us a little off track, but I'm going to talk about it because I'm interested. And it's the idea that the hold on, there's so many ideas going through my head. It's the idea that dang it, it is the idea that that we don't train our teachers very specifically for context in the United States. That's a really important one, and that universities and colleges that are responsible for training teachers in this country are often more contextualized than they are standardized. So we have this dual problem where, on the one hand, our teachers are coming out of these systems at universities and colleges where they might look different at one university than the other university across town. They might have different levels of understanding, different skills in particular, different values in terms of what they can bring to the community. And so there's no standardized quality. But on the other hand, they're not contextualized enough in order to be able to teach in literally any school. So they might have been trained for a particular kind of school or community. I'll give you an example because it sounds silly when I say it so ambiguously. I used to work for a private institution in Tulsa, Oklahoma, called the University of Tulsa. We were the ones who had the system where teachers who were going to teach at the secondary level majored in the area that they were planning on teaching rather than having a specific education degree. Anyway, I was at the University of Tulsa. We did very much focus on the academic and the sort of the scholarship and the really in-depth knowledge around subject area. Across town was, and still is, Oral Roberts University. If you're not familiar with Oral Roberts University, it is a Pentecostal religious private institution. They are built off, Oral Roberts was an evangelist. There's a whole bunch I could say about Oral Roberts University, but they do have a very large and very successful, and by successful, I mean their kids get hired, their graduates get hired, successful college of education. What we found from those of us at the University of Tulsa, we ended up competing with Oral Roberts University in terms of where our graduates would go to teach. And what we found was that Oral Roberts University won in state, especially in the Tulsa area or in that community, because people wanted to hire Oral Roberts graduates because they had a very traditional Christian perspective, which aligned with the values of the communities of most of the schools. We were graduating kids who were going to be like rigorous academic teachers. And so what we found was that most of our kids, instead of going to rural communities, most of them were employed at private college prep schools. And just to be honest, there are more job opportunities at the public school level than there are at the private school level. And so our graduates struggle sometimes to compete for jobs with the RU graduates. It's a great example of how we specialized and we contextualized, but we didn't standardize. And so it was a breakdown in the system. So Meyer makes some points there. I would still argue we need an education degree, but I understand the argument. And then finally, defining the education role. This is Meyer basically saying, let's consolidate. Let's make the federal government more responsible and more in charge of decision-making. Let's centralize that authority and power and see how much better that can work. which I always find ironic, because isn't that the opposite of what the American ideal is, and what the more right-leaning argument is, that instead of centralizing power out of the hands of the community, we should be consolidating power and authority in the hands of the community. I thought that's what it was about. But again, I'm displaying my own political perspective and perhaps my ignorance of the larger argument. And it's a brief section in Myers, so we'll cut Myers some slack and say, maybe he didn't have a chance to explain it all. All right, this has been a fun hour-long conversation. I appreciate you sticking with me to talk about Chapter 16 from our Education Governance for the 21st Century text, and making sure that we're thinking about all these different ways that we can approach governance reform, and thinking about policy to practice. Again, this has been a more high-level discussion, not a very sort of, this is what you do in the trenches, and this is how you want to write that section of your proposal, or whatever it is. But it hopefully has provided you with a framework for thinking about what governance looks like and how we can reform it so that translating the policy to practice makes more sense. What some of the tools are, remember the mechanisms that we can use for the governance instruments that I talked about from Lutz and company on the two-level game, and how those aligned with some of the arguments that Meyer and others out of the Manna and McGinn book are making as well. Okay, thanks for sticking with me. Hope you have a great rest of your day. I can figure out how to stop. Here we go. See ya.